The winds of the north howled like wounded beasts across the vast emptiness of the icy plains. Arya Stark pulled her cloak tighter, her fingers numb, her face burned raw from the relentless cold. Somewhere beyond the wall of mist and falling snow, she knew the dead marched. She had seen them, she had fought them, and she had barely escaped with her life, but something called her back. A pull she couldn't explain, something dark and heavy inside her chest that refused to let her turn away. She hadn't meant to. Separate from the others, Jon had shouted after her as she sprinted into the storm, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring wind. Ghost tracks scattered the snow in every direction. No one would find her now. She was alone, just Arya and the freezing darkness. The first of them appeared like a nightmare formed from the mist itself. A white walker with eyes like cold blue. Suns, standing silent and still, a sword of ice in its hand. Arya's fingers tightened around Needle, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something else. A strange acceptance. Maybe it was time. She had lost so much, her family, her innocence, pieces of herself. Maybe there was nothing left to fight for. The walker didn't charge. It simply stared at her, head tilted slightly as if puzzled. Another stepped from the gloom, and another. Soon they were all around her, a circle of death, but she didn't raise her sword. She didn't run. She just stood there, breathing in the cold, her tears freezing before they could fall. A figure taller than the others approached. His armor was black as coal, etched with strange symbols. His crown was a jagged mess of ice. The Night King, Arya's hand trembled. She remembered leaping at him once, remembered the feeling of Valyrian steel sinking into his chest. She had destroyed him. She had saved them all, or so she had thought. The Night King raised one hand, fingers splayed. A pulse of freezing magic filled the air. Arya gasped as her body locked up as if invisible chains wrapped around her. Pain, pure and blinding, shot through her bones. She tried to scream, but her mouth wouldn't open. Her knees buckled. She collapsed into the snow, her vision going dark at the edges. In the swirling void of her mind, Arya saw them. Her father, her mother, Robb, even Rickon. Faces half forgotten, smiles she had not seen in years. She reached for them, but their images twisted into something monstrous, their eyes glowing blue, their mouths whispering in a language she didn't understand. When she woke, she wasn't cold anymore. She wasn't anything. Arya rose slowly to her feet. The snow melted where her bare feet touched. The wind seemed to bow to her, swirling in lazy patterns around her body. She looked down at her hands, pale, nearly translucent. She brought a hand to her face and felt nothing. No heartbeat, no breath. The Night King stepped back and watched her, waiting. Something had changed inside Arya, something vast and terrible. She turned her gaze toward the south, toward the lands of men, the living. She remembered Winterfell, Sansa, Jon, but the memories felt distant now, like dreams from another life. Her new brothers and sisters, the dead, pressed closer, their loyalty unquestionable, their devotion absolute. Arya Stark of Winterfell was gone. In her place stood something new, something unstoppable. The Night King knelt before her, and one by one, the other walkers followed. She was not merely one of them. She was something more, a queen of ice and death, and deep inside her frozen heart, a single thought remained, a thought sharper than any blade she had ever wielded. This time, I won't miss. The march south began. Under a sky heavy with snow, the armies of the dead grew with every village they passed. No one was spared, no one was forgiven. In the silence of endless winter, Arya led them all. A ghost in the shape of a girl, a wolf with ice in her veins. Winter had come and it wore her face. The Riverlands were the first to fall. Under Arya's cold command, the dead swept across. Fields and villages like a living plague. No horns sounded warnings. No armies rode out to defend their homes. It happened too fast, too quietly. One night the people sang songs by their fires, and by the next morning the fires were cold, the songs silenced forever. Arya moved among the fallen like a wraith. Her once brown hair, now pale as frost, floated around her like mist. Her clothes, once leather and wool, had fused into something otherworldly, robes stitched by ice and magic itself. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her will was their command. Every knight who knelt before her sword was raised again as a hollow shell, loyal only to her. But even as her army grew, something gnawed at the back of her mind. Faces, names, people she should have hated, but somehow still remembered. Gendry, Sansa, John. The memory of him was the sharpest. His voice calling out in the snowstorm. His arms once wrapped around her in a hug she hadn't known she needed. His stupid, stubborn loyalty. He would be waiting somewhere. He would be the one standing in her path when the dead reached Winterfell. The thought filled her with something close to excitement and dread. At Harrenhal, the ruins cracked under the weight of winter. Arya climbed the broken towers alone, drawn by a strange sense of destiny. Here once she had been nothing. A servant, a whisper. Here she had learned how to survive, how to kill. Now she had returned as death itself. In the shattered hall where Tywin Lannister had once plotted his wars, Arya stood and waited. She knew they would come to her here. She could feel them approaching like a ripple in the still air. It was the Brotherhood without banners who arrived first, ragged and desperate, men she had once followed, once trusted. They came armed with fire, torches, burning swords, hoping to banish the dark with their tiny flames. Arya stepped out into the open, her pale skin gleaming under the dying sun. She didn't draw a weapon. She didn't have to. By the Lord of Light, Beric Dondarrion whispered, his voice thick with horror. What have you become? She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a curious animal. There was no anger in her heart, no hatred, just a cold certainty. These men, these relics of a dying world, could not be allowed to stand. Beric raised his sword, flames licking hungrily along the blade. Forgive me, Arya Stark. She smiled, a slow, terrible thing, and then she moved. In life, Arya had been fast. In death, she was faster. She crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, her fingers slicing through the air like blades. Beric barely had time to bring up his sword before she struck. His body hit the ground without a sound. The others fled. It didn't matter. The dead rose where they fell, bound to her will. Soon the Brotherhood marched with her, their torches extinguished, their bodies grey and hollow. Each victory made her stronger. Each death fed the cold fire inside her chest. Yet still, somewhere deep inside, a tiny ember of the old Arya flickered weakly, refusing to die. At night, when she stood alone at the edges of ruined towns, she sometimes heard whispers in the wind. Her own voice, young and fierce, reciting names like prayers, Cersei, Walder Frey, Island Pane, the Mountain. They were all dead now. Her list was finished. But still the voice persisted, scratching at the walls of her mind. One name lingered louder than all the others. Jon Snow, Winterfell, loomed ahead, dark and silent under the bleeding skies. Arya paused on a hill, overlooking the land she had once called home. The castle walls stood strong, but she could feel the fear leaking through the stones like a scent. They knew she was coming. They were ready, or so they thought. Her army stretched. Behind her, a sea of hollow faces and broken bodies, waiting for her signal. Arya closed her dead eyes, feeling the power surge through her limbs. This wasn't just about conquest. This was about an ending she had been marching toward her whole life. She opened her eyes, and they blazed with icy fire. Without a word, she lifted her hand and pointed toward Winterfell. The dead moved as one, a tide of silence and death. and Arya, queen of the White Walkers, led them home. The gates of Winterfell groaned under the weight of the coming storm. Inside the walls, every living soul prepared for the impossible. Archers lined the battlements with trembling hands. Blacksmiths hammered swords and spears late into the night. And though they knew in their hearts steel would not save them, maesters whispered prayers to gods old and new. Children cried in the arms of mothers who had nowhere left to run. Jon Snow stood at the center of the courtyard, his hand resting on the pommel of Longclaw. He could feel the cold already, seeping through the stones, stealing the warmth from the air. He knew who led them. No one had to tell him. The scouts who returned spoke only in broken whispers of a girl with hair like frozen silver, a face half remembered from a different life, commanding the dead with a flick of her wrist. Arya. He had seen many horrors since he first marched beyond the wall. He had faced the Night King himself, but nothing prepared him for this. His sister, no more than a sister, his blood, his heart, had returned as their doom. Sansa stood beside him, cloaked in furs, her face carved from stone. She showed no fear, but Jon knew her well enough to see the tremble in her clenched jaw. "She's not Arya anymore," Sansa said, her voice cold and even. "You know that?" Jon said nothing. Part of him wanted to believe that somewhere inside, the thing marching toward them, his little sister, still lived, that maybe somehow she could be reached, saved. But the part of him that had fought the dead before knew better. Once the Night King's magic took you, there was no coming back. The horns sounded, low, mournful blasts that echoed over the frozen fields. The dead had arrived. From the battlements they saw the first wave, shambling bodies in tattered armor, faces twisted into masks of frozen agony. Among them rode the reanimated remains of fallen knights, their horses nothing but bones and frost-bitten flesh. Above them, circling like vultures, wights on the backs of undead dragons screamed into the blood-red sky, and at the head of it all, Arya. Jon's chest tightened painfully at the sight of her. She was beautiful and terrible all at once, a vision out of some dark old tale. She rode no horse. She didn't need to. She walked, barefoot across the ice, the dead parting around her like ripples around a stone. Her eyes locked onto the castle, and for a moment Jon swore she saw him, not the army, not the fortress. Him. Arya raised her hand, and the dead charged. The first impact shook the very walls of Winterfell. Waves of dead crashed against the gates, their clawed hands scraping wood and stone. Fire arrows rained down from the battlements, lighting the night with trails of gold and red. But the dead didn't scream or falter. They burned, and still they climbed. Jon roared orders, rallying the living to hold their ground. He swung Longclaw with brutal efficiency, cleaving through dead flesh and ice-crusted armor. Around him, men and women fought desperately, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. Sansa retreated deeper into the keep, commanding the last line of defense. The old and the young, armed with anything they could lift. She tried not to think about Arya, about the girl who had once laughed beside her under the weirwood tree, who had once promised to never leave her behind. Outside, the gates finally gave way with a thunderous crack. The dead poured into Winterfell. Jon fought his way toward the breach, slashing and hacking with every ounce of strength left in him, but even he knew it was hopeless. For every dead man he felled, two more rose in his place, and then, through the chaos, he saw her. Arya moved like a ghost, her feet barely touching the ground, weaving through the battle untouched. Where she passed, men dropped to their knees, clutching their throats as ice spread rapidly through their veins. She was a force of nature, a blizzard in the shape of a girl. Jon broke away from the front lines, heart pounding. He had to reach her, had to try. He fought his way forward, shouting her name over the roar of the battle. "Arya! Arya!" For a moment she paused, tilted her head, Recognition flickered. Or was it just the cruel trick of memory? Then she turned, her gaze pinning him where he stood, and Jon felt a cold more savage than any winter he had ever known crawl up his spine. She smiled, not the smile he remembered, not the mischievous grin of a little girl who had once chased cats through castle halls. This was something else, something ancient, something dead, and yet, somewhere, deep within those ice-blue eyes, something flickered. A hesitation. It was all Jon needed. He tightened his grip on Longclaw and took a step. Toward her, his voice breaking the air like a whip. "Come home, Arya." The battle around them blurred into noise and chaos as Jon stepped closer. Bodies fell, arrows screamed through the air, fires crackled, but none of it mattered. All he saw was her. Arya, his fierce little sister, now standing as the nightmare. Of everything he had fought against for years. Arya tilted her head again, studying him like some strange creature she wasn't sure she recognized. The hesitation lingered, a flicker of confusion, maybe even pain. Jon clung to it with everything he had. "You don't have to do this," Jon said, his voice rough, his breath frosting the air between them. "You're Arya Stark. You're my blood." The army of the dead slowed around them, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. The whites at her back paused, waiting for her command. For a heartbeat, Jon thought he saw her falter. Her lips parted slightly, and a ghost of something, memory, regret, flashed across her pale face. Then it was gone. She moved faster than anything Jon had ever seen. One moment she was standing still. The next, she was on him, a blur of ice. And death. He barely managed to raise Longclaw in time, the Valyrian steel shrieking as it met her bare hand. Not a sword, not claws, just her fingers, strengthened by magic so old and dark it could match the steel of kings. The force of the impact threw Jon backward, crashing into a pile of broken timber. Pain lanced through his ribs, but he forced himself to stand. Arya stalked. Toward him, her expression blank, empty. Jon didn't lift his sword again. Instead, he let it fall into the snow. Around them, the dead shifted uneasily, uncertain. Without her direct command, they hesitated. "You're stronger than this," Jon said, every word like a plea to the girl who had once held his hand under the stars and whispered secrets only family could understand. "You beat the Night King once. You saved us all." Her face twisted slightly. A flicker of memory, maybe. A muscle ticked in her frozen jaw. "You were the bravest of all of us," he said. "You are Arya Stark of Winterfell. You are not his puppet." He didn't know if she understood. He didn't know if there was even enough left of her to fight the magic choking her soul. But Jon refused to raise his blade against her. If she killed him, so be it. He would not be the one to drive the final stake through whatever part of Arya still remained. Arya stopped just a breath away from him. Her hands, pale and cracked with veins of shimmering ice, hovered at his chest, inches from his heart. He could feel the unnatural cold radiating off her. It was like standing before the mouth of death itself. For a moment, her hands trembled. Her dead blue eyes stared into his. Jon barely dared to breathe. A sharp noise cracked the frozen air, a howl, wild and desperate. Ghost, Jon's direwolf, burst from the chaos, bloodied but alive, charging straight for Arya. Arya turned at the last instant. With a flick of her hand, she sent Ghost flying into the snow with a yelp of pain. Jon roared in fury and anguish, instinct taking over. He snatched Longclaw from the snow and drove it forward in a desperate thrust. Arya caught the blade in her bare hands. For one terrible second, the world seemed to freeze. The steel steamed against her icy flesh. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, a soundless expression of agony and rage, and something else. Sorrow. Jon's heart shattered. Arya staggered back, dropping the sword, clutching her hands as if trying to tear something invisible from her. Skin. Cracks formed across her arms, glowing blue at first, then spider-webbing into blinding white. Her body convulsed as the magic inside her fought against itself. The army of the dead let out a collective shriek, a sound of confusion and fear. Jon rushed forward, catching Arya as she collapsed. She was cold. Gods, she was so cold. But he held her anyway, cradling her broken body against his chest. "Arya," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers, feeling the frostbite eating into his skin. "Come back, please." For a moment the world was silent except for the soft hiss of falling snow. Then Arya's hand, still trembling, touched his cheek. Her eyes, still blue, still dead, met his, and she whispered one word, so soft it barely reached his ears. "Home." Jon felt the burst of magic before he saw it. A shockwave of cold and light exploded outward from Arya's body, blasting the dead to the ground. The wights crumbled like dust. The dragons above shrieked and fell from the sky, their rotted wings folding uselessly. The spell was breaking, but so was Arya. Jon held her tighter as her body began to collapse, pieces of her crumbling into frost and snow, melting in his arms. "No!" he choked, rocking her gently as if he could keep her soul stitched together by will alone. "No, please." But Arya Stark was slipping away, not as a monster, not as a White Walker, but as a girl, a Stark of Winterfell, who had fought her way back from the darkest abyss. She gave him a tiny broken smile, the smile he remembered, the real one. And then her body dissolved completely into mist and light, leaving Jon alone, kneeling in the blood-stained snow. The storm broke. The dead were gone. The world was silent again. But Winterfell had paid a terrible price for its salvation, and Jon Snow, once again, had no family left to call his own. The dawn after the battle was a muted, ugly thing. Pale sunlight barely broke through the heavy grey clouds, casting a sickly light over the ruins of Winterfell. Smoke still curled from broken towers. The once proud banners of House Stark hung in tatters. Blood stained the snow, and the air smelled of ash, iron, and something worse, the stink of grief. Jon sat alone at the base of the weirwood tree, its red leaves trembling in the cold wind. His cloak was torn, his armor dented, but he barely felt the pain. His sword lay abandoned at his side. He stared at his hands, cracked and raw from the battle, but it wasn't the wounds that troubled him. It was the emptiness. Arya was gone, truly gone this time. No magic left to raise her, no tricks, no gods. She had saved them all by destroying. Herself and the world had moved on without her, as it always did. Sansa approached slowly, her steps crunching over the brittle snow. She had wrapped herself in a heavy grey cloak, the direwolf stitched in silver over her heart. She looked older than he remembered, lines of sorrow etched deep into her face, her blue eyes colder than the winter around them. She knelt beside Jon, silent for a long time before speaking. "She saved us." Jon nodded, but the movement felt hollow. "She chose it," Sansa added, her voice thick but steady. "You gave her the choice, Jon. You gave her a way back. She took it." He turned his head, staring into the gnarled face of the weirwood. She shouldn't have had to choose at all. Sansa didn't argue. There was no comfort to offer, only truths that cut deeper than swords. The survivors gathered what they could. They burned the bodies, whites and friends alike, on great pyres outside the gates. No one sang, no one spoke. The fires cracked and spit as the dead returned to the ashes they should have never left. When the last pyre burned low, Jon stood before the people. Soldiers, farmers, children, the broken remains of the North. They looked at him with a desperate kind of hope, the same way they had looked at him after Hardhome, after the Battle of the Bastards, after the Long Night. He didn't want their hope. He didn't deserve it, but he carried it anyway, because there was no one else left to do so. He spoke simply because anything more would have been a lie. Arya Stark saved us. She gave her life to stop the dead. We live because she remembered who she was. Never forget that, never forget her. The words hung heavy in the air. No cheers followed, just silence and bowed heads. In the days that followed, Winterfell began to rebuild. Stones were lifted, walls mended, weapons reforged. The scars would remain, but life clawed its way back stubbornly, as it always did. Jon spent his nights alone, in the Godswood, haunted by dreams of Arya. Sometimes she was still a child, chasing cats through the halls. Sometimes she was a white walker, her dead eyes accusing him. And sometimes, the worst nights, she was simply gone, a shadow fading into mist. He spoke to her, even though he knew no one answered. He apologized for failing her. He thanked her for saving them all. One night, as the snow fell soft and slow over Winterfell, Ghost padded into the Godswood, his side bandaged, his eyes watchful and wise. He settled beside Jon with a low, comforting growl. Jon buried his hands in the direwolf's thick fur and closed his eyes. "Arya's gone, Ghost," he murmured. "But we're still here." Ghost thumped his tail against the ground, as if agreeing. The world outside the north buzzed with rumors of the death of the Night King's heir, of the last stand at Winterfell. Some called Jon a hero, some called him a fool. None of it mattered to him. He had lost too much to care about titles and songs. What mattered was keeping Arya's memory alive, keeping the North strong, stubborn and free, just as she had been, and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to forgive himself. The snow continued to fall, covering the scars of battle, the broken stones, the blood-soaked fields. Winter had passed, but the ache in Jon Snow's heart would never thaw. The seasons turned, slowly, painfully. Spring crept into the north, not with bright flowers and green fields, but with stubborn patches of thawed earth and thin sunlight. Life clawed its way back, as it always did. Winterfell stood again, though the stones seemed older now, heavier. The people rebuilt with quiet determination. Every beam they raised, every stone they set into place felt like a prayer to the dead. To Arya, her name became something sacred. A new carving was made in the Godswood. A small stone wolf crouched at the base of the weirwood tree. No grand statues, no crowns, no lies, just a wolf, ready to fight, ready to endure. Like her. Jon visited the carving every day, sometimes sitting for hours, speaking softly to it, as if Arya herself might answer. He found a strange peace there, even as the world outside moved on. The North had changed. Those who survived were harder, colder. They trusted less, demanded more. They had seen what the dead could do. They had seen what loyalty, love, even mercy could cost. When the South sent envoys asking for allegiance, smooth-talking lords and polished knights speaking of unity, Sansa sent them away without a second thought. "The North remembers," she said, her voice sharp as the winter wind, "and the North stands alone." She ruled from Winterfell now, queen in the North, but it was not the reign she had dreamed of as a child. There were no songs, no fairy tales, only long days of work and long nights filled with the names of those they had lost. Jon stayed by her side, but the crown never touched his brow again. He wore no titles, took no honors. He was simply Jon Snow, the last wolf who had no place. In a world built on ashes, he spent most of his time beyond the walls, riding with Ghost through the wild places of the North. Some said he was searching for something. Others said he was running from what he had lost. The truth was, he didn't know himself. One evening, as the sun set over the frozen fields, Jon climbed a hill overlooking Winterfell. The castle glowed against the twilight, smoke rising peacefully from the chimneys, voices drifting faintly on the wind. He thought of Arya, her quick smile, her deadly grace, the fire in her heart that even death couldn't steal. He thought of how close they had come to losing everything, and how somehow, despite it all, they had survived. Jon closed his eyes and whispered her name into the wind. Arya. The breeze stirred around him, soft and cold, almost playful, as if someone, heard him. He smiled, a small, broken thing, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he didn't feel quite so alone. Down in Winterfell, children ran through the courtyards, shouting and laughing, their wooden swords clashing in the fading light. In the godswood, the old weirwood tree stood watch, its red leaves whispering secrets to those who would listen. The world was broken. The world was healing. And somewhere, in the endless white, beyond the world of men, a lone wolf ran across the snow, faster and freer than any creature alive, a shadow, a whisper, a legend, Arya Stark, lost and found, gone but never forgotten, the last promise of winter, the last hope of the north, and the beating heart that even death could not silence.